All right, so much for the introduction. Now, what is this about? What is the idea for the symposium? We started thinking about this about a year ago because I got here to TUM with the idea I want to advance integrated land use transportation modeling. And I thought the best way to bring it to the next level is to bring smart people into one room and brainstorm on what the next generation of integrated land use transport models could look like. And so that's why I invited you guys. I want you to present your work and want you to engage you in brainstorming how we can lift this to the next level. I recently read an article where the author claimed at conferences we should never present peer-reviewed research, but rather research that we are actually working on currently, because something that's already peer-reviewed is something that is done, that is completed, that is vetted by other experts. Whereas work we are still working on, that's something where interaction with others actually can benefit us. I'm not sure I'd subscribe to this 100% because sometimes we learn from hearing about work you have done, but the idea of this workshop is to less give presentations on this is work we have done some point in the past, but rather this is work we have done and this is what we learned from this is where we go next, because I think that's more interesting for the interaction, for the discussion. Of course, I want to hear about your experiences because where you go is based on what you have done before. But that's a little bit the idea. So you're welcome to present ideas that are under development. It doesn't need to be ready and fully thought through, but it can be half-baked and something where you want to go next, what your thinking in this field is. Well, and I hope we get it more interactive, less lecture style, even though I realize I'm lecturing here, so I'm giving a bad example starting this. Okay, so that is the idea of why you were invited, why I wanted to put together this workshop. And this is a graphic that we're probably going to see several times here, which of course is a famous graphic by Michael Wegener that shows the interaction between land use and transport. But traditionally, we use accessibility as a link from the transport system to the land use system, and we use the location of households and workplaces and what activities they do as a link back to the transportation system. So that's something that goes back to the 1970s, I would argue, if not 60s. And the idea of this workshop is, what do we preserve from this picture, and how do we move this to the next level? Yeah, so traditionally these models are loosely coupled. We have these connectors. So now there are 4 big topics that I have in mind for this workshop where I would like this to go. One is, what theory do we need to better understand the interaction between land use and transport? Because I do have the feeling that a lot of times we just do something ad hoc because we know how it's done technically, without having a lot of theory behind why we pass these data from the land use model to the transport model. So I want to think about that. What kind of models do we need? So for example, we heard about pedestrian modeling. Some people think about health models. Some people talk about fiscal impact models. What other models do we need to better get this connection between land use and transport? Then when we couple these models, what data is moved from one model to another, and which methods, maybe computer methods, are transferred from one model to another? And last but not least, how is this integration? So Kai Nagel was pointing to, well, it's beneficial if it's in one software. That's certainly a topic we want to talk about. How do we work with the data? Is there some relational database or something like that? What are the pros and cons of different levels of tightness of model integration? These are the topics that I have in mind. Let's see how many of these questions we actually get to tackle during the workshop. Okay, so one way of documenting this workshop is to videotape this, but I also was hoping that we get something more out of this workshop. And my idea was, if we get to have a good discussion here and good brainstorming, we might have new ideas how we can do model integration. And if we get there, I would like each of us to write an article about that and submit this article to a peer-reviewed journal. Now, I talked to 2 editors. I first talked to David Levinson from the Journal of Transport and Land Use. He was excited about this idea. He thought that's a good idea, and he would be happy to dedicate a special issue on these integration issues. And I would invite all of you to contribute to such a special issue. Of course, we also can invite other people who are not here to contribute, but the idea is that we would start thinking about what could go into such an article. And the other journal editor I talked to is Mike Betty. Mike Betty was invited to this symposium, but on short notice he had to cancel. He couldn't make it. He had too many conflicting appointments. But he also was excited about this idea, and he said, oh, absolutely, yeah, we should do a special issue. I think these are both very good journals, and I don't have a strong preference one way or the other. The only thing to consider is the Journal of Land Use and Transport is an open source journal, and you need to pay $500 to get it published. There's a publication fee. It's free to publish in Environment and Planning. You can do it make it open source, but then there's a $3,000 publication fee, which is beyond of what I, for example, would be allowed to pay at TUM. The 500, I only can pay, I checked this before this workshop, I only can pay the $500 on papers where I am the co-author. I do not want to be the co-author on all of your papers, so that would fall on you if you chose that journal.
Rolf, if you join Whistler, the World Society of Land Use and Transport Research, you get one free article a year in JTLU. So I think for the bargain price of $75 for 3-year membership.
Wow, that's cheating. I didn't know that, see? Okay, all right, it already paid off to come here. Saves you $445. So that's something that I have in mind, to put together a special issue in one of these two journals, unless you have another journal that you have in mind. I don't think we need to decide this now, but if someone wants to comment on that, you're welcome to. Any thoughts on this?
I'm certainly for open access, and given the two price levels, I think my preference is clear.
Yeah, good point.
Potentially, you could do different issues and actually in different journals. So actually, we're having enough people. I'm not sure how many articles they can accommodate for one special issue. So if all of the people here were right, plus some others you invite, then there may be too many for just one journal.
Could be.
What's bad with refereeing?
Say this again.
What is bad with submitting papers for peer review, yeah, and then you don't need to pay anything?
But the readers need to pay them. Yeah.
So both journals are peer reviewed. It's just the environment and planning and environment, you don't pay a publication fee, but then only those who have access to the journal can read your article, right? Whereas Journal of Land Use Transport is open source, it's just accessible online. Then you need to pay the $500 up front. Okay, so something to keep in mind, and I hope this comes up during this workshop here and there again, and then towards the end I would like to bring this up again and would like to make a decision where to move. But that's what I have in mind. And I guess we can discuss this again when we have better ideas on how much we get out of this workshop and what ideas we have for writing such papers. Okay, should everything fail and we don't come up with any good ideas, this is where we're going to go to worship. This is a beautiful church which is right next door, which I just recommend you to visit at some point during this workshop. This is a building, it's a Roman style building, so it has been built more than 800 years ago, and the entire interior is in this Rococo style. It's heavily overloaded. I mean, it's kitsch pure. It's pretty tough, but it's impressive to see. So I recommend you to jump in there at some point and just have a peek. All right, so far the introduction, and we are pretty much on schedule here. So now I would like to start with the first input here that is actual technical on integration of land use and transport modeling. So it gave me some bad feeling to put me first in the program, but I discussed this with a couple of people and they said, well, you should present first just to set the stage where you're coming from and why you're doing this workshop. So I put myself in first place now to start the presentation, just so to give an idea where things going. What I'm talking about is the integrated land use transport modeling suite that my team and I are developing at TUM. Where the idea is to bring integration of land use and transport modeling to the next level, and we do this with an example for the urban region, metropolitan region of Munich. And this again is of course the motivation of all this, because land use and transport influence each other strongly. We want to represent both in the model sufficiently. Now the model design, and when I present this here, I really would like you to chime in whenever you have a comment or question or critique or any feedback. Please just chime in right away. I know the microphone makes it harder to have this discussion, but just speak up and let's discuss this so it's less lecture style. Okay, so we started with the idea for the Munich metropolitan area to build this model, and we looked at commute flows to delineate the study area. It's something I learned from Michael Wegener. You look at commute flows, and it's a good indicator how big your study area should be. And because Munich is a fairly high-priced area, the average rent of newly rented apartments 30% above to move further out. So people with lower income, they move further out, and we have quite some commute connections to neighboring cities like Augsburg, Ingolstadt, Rosenheim, and Landshut. And in discussion with Gebhardt-Wulfhorst, we looked at these data and we decided, well, the study area needs to be that big to capture the entire commuter shed, or the majority of the commuter shed. So that's how we delineated our study area. And then one of my students, Joe Morley, he did a very smart thing. He built this tool to create raster cells. It's based on an idea that Rick Donnelly and I developed for the state of Georgia, where you have larger raster cells for rural areas and smaller raster cells for urban areas. And Joe Morley took this and put this into Python and built a very simple tool that creates these raster cells. And he took it one level. So here you see a little bit better how the smaller raster cells are in the urban areas and larger raster cells in rural areas. And this way we put most resources of the spatial resolution to those areas where most activity is. And now Joe took this one step further, because if you do raster cells and you cut through with the municipality boundaries, which is the level where you get a lot of data, you end up with a lot of small slivers and small pieces. What Joe did is he wrote an algorithm to merge these small slivers that do not have sufficient activity and merge them to neighboring raster cells. I think it's a cool little tool, or like Donald Trump would say, something I'm not unproud of. So it's just a cool little tool. And like everything we do in my research group is open source, so you can access this tool on GitHub and you can use it yourself if this helps your work somehow. But for us it was important because we didn't have one unified zone system for the entire study area. We needed to create this from scratch. And this is the network that we are using. It's the open source street network. And Carlos has worked on pulling this from the web and implementing this with MetSim, and he ran first assignments on the NetSim. Oh, we shouldn't call this assignment. The first trips he sent through the network. Okay, and this is the land use model that we are implementing, and this has developed a lot with discussions with many of you here in the room. And it was actually Rick who gave the first initial input and say, well, we need a land use model. So this is what we put together. It's a land use model that only works in places with M. So we have had it so far in Minneapolis, Maryland, and now in Munich. It's a synthetic, it works as a microsimulation. So it first creates a synthetic population. There's a module that does demographic changes, a module for real estate development, and there's household relocation module, and the new location of households and employment is then fed into a travel demand model. And this as well is open source, so it's accessible to anyone to work with. And the way we implement this here in Munich now, we try to integrate this with MetSim. And Kai Nagel and I, we were lucky to just recently win a project from the German, funded through the German Research Foundation to do this integration. And this is the entire idea how it works. So we have Silo that does land use. Then we have in the middle, we have one tool that we call MITO, Microscopic Transport Orchestrator. Actually, first it was called TIMO, which I liked so much better, but then I have two co-workers who are from Spain, and they told me, oh, TIMO is a Spanish word and means fraud. Well, that's not a good name for a model. So we switched it into mito, which is myth, right? It's translated, not perfect, but it's better than fraud. So we have this myth of travel demand. We have a microscopic trip generation model. We estimate travel time budget, which is something that Anna has written, where we have the idea picked up from Zahavi that people have a constant travel time budget, and this travel time budget doesn't change much over time, and that's why we calculate the travel time budget. And it's not that the travel time budget was a hard constraint for an individual household, because for a certain period of time we may exceed our travel time budget. Yeah, when I commuted in Maryland, I was on a bus for an hour, which is way more than I want to, but I did this for a certain period of time, but then I switched back. So the way the travel time budget is used, it's used as a guideline how much traveling we do, and only on the average for the entire population, this travel time budget is a constraint, and people stay within this travel time budget. And the idea being, if congestion gets worse, or if transportation becomes more expensive, people actually travel less. They don't travel the same distances, but they travel less to stay within their travel time budget. That's the idea. It's a microscopic destination choice model, most choice model, and departure time model, and that is then fed into MatSim, which puts this traffic onto the highway system and also on the transit system. We still have some trouble with transit because we're trying to use GTFS data, Google Transit Feed data. We're working on this. It's in the middle of this. I would say this complete model setup is now halfway being set up, halfway being operational. Anna has done a lot of work creating the synthetic population, so that's pretty much done. Silo works, and here we are halfway through, so we are getting there. Yeah, this is the idea. Okay, just a few words about Silo. These are events that are modeled in Silo because it's a micro-simulation. It models these individual events for households and dwellings and people. You can read this list faster than I can read it to you, but what is important is that we have some events that are spatial and others that are aspatial, non-spatial. Those that are spatial, we use logit models to make decisions. Those that are aspatial, we use Markov transition models. And these events happen in random order. So somewhere someone married, somewhere else a child is born, someone else, someone is moving, so that we avoid any path dependency based on how we set up the model, in which order we do it. There's still this feedback, if someone has a child, they are likely to move into a larger apartment, but this feedback would be the following year. Within 1 year, these events are entirely randomized. Okay, and the one thing that we care a lot about in this model is modeling constraints, because I think that's a problem in our modeling community, that for too long we have tried to maximize utilities, which often led to very long travel, even under congested conditions. But I think that thinking about constraints has a huge impact on how we travel and how we find household location choices. Because constraints are real, like the price of the dwelling, I have to find a dwelling that is within my budget, that is a hard constraint, yeah, or how much I pay for travel. Parking availability. If I need to go to work by car, I need a place where I can park my car. So that's something we care a lot about putting in this model. And the first constraint we have in the model is household expenditures. This is now based on data from the US, so we are slowly converting this into German data, but this is now from the US, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where the x-axis shows the income and the y-axis shows how much households have spent. Now, the first thing that really struck me was that in lower income ranges, people spend more than they earn. And I first thought, oh, that can't be right. So I called them up and I discussed with them, and they said, no, that's actually true, because people with lower incomes, they sometimes become unemployed and then they draw into their savings, or they take a student loan, or they're retirees who live on their savings. So this is actually true that people with lower income spend more than they have. People with higher income spend less, and the rest goes into savings or investments. Okay, this we are using to define different expenditure categories. Particularly, we're interested in fuel expenditures, thinking what happens if fuel becomes more expensive. It's a really small sliver down here, fuel expenditures. But if you go into the low income range, this small sliver is relevant. And we did some work on defining which expenditures are actually mandatory, what I have to pay, like clothing and food, some things I cannot replace. But then there are some expenditures that we defined as being discretionary, something that could be replaced or left out if I ran out of money. Okay, so this gives us our available income for a household, and then this is what we call discretionary income. And when we run a scenario where housing or fuel costs become more expensive, transportation becomes more expensive, people have to rearrange their income, and this discretionary income is basically the wiggle room they have, what they can play with to adjust their spending. And you see, if you have less than $40,000 a year, there's very little room to play with your spending. And this is a hard constraint that's built into Silo. The other constraint is travel time, which I believe is a true constraint. If this was my workplace, and this is still a visualization from the US, so Washington, D.C. is here, Baltimore is up here. If this was my workplace in Bethesda, Maryland, you can see the travel time from this workplace. And I can look at a household travel time survey to get the average trip length frequency distribution for work trips. And so if I do this, I get a certain probability where someone lives. So based on the workplace, I get a probability where someone would find housing. And within this yellow area, I capture 99% of all workers according to the survey I'm using here. Right, so this would be the shed where someone would be looking for housing. The darker the color, the more likely is that I would find housing there. Now someone else who works in Columbia, Maryland, would have this commuter shed and would look housing in this area. And then when you think there's a household that has 2 workers, and maybe these 2 workers live in the same household, then they would have a commuter shed that would bring the housing search particularly towards this banana here along the highway corridor. And that's another thing that's implemented in Silo, that people have to stay within certain distances to their workplace. So if congestion gets worse, people actually have to move closer towards their work location. Right? So, and this is 36% of all employees in the surveys are 2-person households, two worker households, or more than 2 workers. So this is actually very real for many households. And from my own experience, this is a very hard constraint, when I and my family look for housing. Okay, so that's the second constraint that is built into the model right now. And the way we do this is those utilities that are replaceable, like the size of an apartment, quality of an apartment, those are added. It's simply weighted addition. But those parameters that are crucial, those are multiplied in a Cobb-Douglas function. That's something. Another thing I learned from Michael Wegener, to make sure that these non-replaceable factors are multiplied, because if one of these utilities becomes 0 or close to 0, the entire utility becomes 0, and the household will look for another place to stay. Okay, this I don't want to spend much time on, because this is something we did in Maryland, where we integrated Silo with a macroscopic 4-step travel demand model. And so these interactions we got already in Maryland. So that is something I would say is the traditional way of integrating land use and transport models. But my second to last slide, where I want to spend more time on, is where I want to bring this, where I want to move this, which is a microscopic integration of land use and transport. Because the idea is that if we have both the land use model and the transport model as a microsimulation, we can look at actual individual travel times that people experience when they travel. So for example, someone who has to go to work and needs to be there at 5:30 in the morning, this person has a different level of congestion and different availability of transit modes than someone who goes to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so by microscopic model integration, I believe, that is the idea, I can represent this explicitly for every worker in the household. So this way, I call this here individual travel time that would affect household relocation. So it's not the aggregate accessibility, but it's actually what people experience when they travel. That we are working with a microscopic simulation on the land use side. We also know a lot of attributes of each household, which we can put into travel demand generation. So I not only know the income, but I also know the education level. I could know whether they own a smartphone or not, so I can add certain attributes to the synthetic population that help me to get this right. And then this is another idea, non-motorized travel, if people do a lot of non-motorized travel, so walk and biking, their life expectancy increases. So there was research by Woodcock in the UK. They compared life expectancy data and compared it to health data, and they found that people who have an active travel behavior using active modes, they do have a slightly higher risk of getting involved in an accident, but they also have much healthier lifestyle, and therefore the life expectancy expands. So I wonder, why not adjust life expectancy in the land use model, which currently is just a static life expectancy by age and sex. Well, and last but not least, something like owning a GPS or a smartphone could also adjust route choice. So the idea is, could medicine become smarter about finding the right route if you know more about the traveler who is traveling? So that's the idea of getting to, well, how about we do a microscopic integration? And so this is my last slide here. So one big discussion that Michael Wegener opened right now is how much micro, how much macro do we need? And I would say microsimulation is not that expensive anymore. It has become easier to process microsimulation. And the great benefit of doing microsimulation is that I work with synthetic population, and it's almost trivial to add additional attributes to the synthetic population. So for example, if I'm interested in which impact have smartphone and smartphone ownership, I can add this attribute to my synthetic population. Each person has this or does not have it, and it's fairly straightforward to implement this. Another thing, project ideas that Harut and I were discussing, well, how about looking into travel for disadvantaged parts of the population, so people with low income or people with disabilities. Now, having a microsimulation is very easy to add this attribute to each person, how disabled, mentally or physically disabled a person is. And as I learned in preparation for this research, that 13.9% of all Germans are disabled. So I mean, that's a big number. It's mostly elderly people, but it is a big number, right? So that's something we can account for if we use the microsimulation, because the data, the way we hold the data is extremely flexible in the microsimulation. Yeah, and I believe that this constraint, so that was one of the motivations when Rick and I first sat together and thought about Silo. We said these constraints is something we really care about, to put those into the model. And my hypothesis is that we're going to be better able to model actual constraints people have to deal with if we microsimulate this model integration. Okay, so that's where I come from. That was my motivation, getting you all together, and fairly good on time, a little bit behind, but we still have like 20 minutes or so to chat about this. I'm a little concerned that I just talked and nobody interrupted me, so I was thinking you guys would be a little bit more active. Are you? Oh.
Well, just to pick up on your last slide here, certainly I would agree entirely. I think microsimulation is, I would say, essential to be addressing the sorts of concerns you're talking about, but all sorts of others. That the only way you can bring these sorts of constraints in is at the individual level, and certainly in our own work, not so much on the land use side, but on the transportation side, it's just. I mean, we're modeling individual travel completely within household constraints, and that's simplified the model in terms of our ability to predict what people do. If you get the constraints right, then their decisions actually become fairly rational. We feel in most cases, and again, on the transportation side, you can't do tour-based modeling any other way. I mean, and you can't really think about how you use cars properly any other way, as far as I'm concerned. And I also agree that if one pays attention to your software and your programming and parallelize things, microsimulation is not a computational problem. I mean, we're simulating, depending on the simulation, between 6.5 and 10 million people in 2 hours for entire region. 24-hour travel. In 2 hours, 90% plus of that is the road and transit network assignments, which eat up all the time. So simulating what the people's decision making goes very, very fast. So yes, and you know, I mean, well, again, I agree.
To follow up Eric's comment, could you tell us the total commuting time for a whole simulation run, about how many years? How many percent of agents in the land use part and of travelers in the transport part do you model? How many times do you repeat the simulation in order to get along with stochastic variation? And what is the comparable number to the 2 hours per day Eric mentioned in terms of computing time?
Okay, so this is half-baked information now because it's not fully operational. We have estimated based on how long it runs in Maryland and how many agents we have here, that the land use model runs from the year 2000 to the year 2050 in 3.5 hours. So that is 50 years, and we have 2.5 million households. 4.5 million is the population approximately. But that is only the land use side. Now on the transportation side, I'm going to give the microphone to Carlos, because he started working with MatSim and assigning, and that is still an open question, how long it actually takes. But can you give us just some numbers where we stand right now?
Yeah, it's something that we don't know still, but we're playing with, starting with 100%, but reducing it to 50%, 10%, 5%, because with the whole population, I mean, everybody's going to work. It's 1.7 million people going to work. 50% of them are taking the car. If we want to model this 50%, this 800,000 trips, then we need around almost 6 hours to simulate the transportation part, only for people going to work, which is quite a lot for one day. No, it's only for one day every time we want to run the transportation part. Yeah, we haven't decided that yet, but it should be in some more than one time probably, but not like every year. So things will change as far as the network change, or the land use, or the allocation of people and jobs. But it's not closed.
Yeah, so that's something we are still working on. And in 2008 or so, at WCTR in Berkeley, at the SIG-1 meeting, David Simmons was giving a presentation, and he said a model run needs to finish with overnight. It needs to be an overnight run. That's the acceptable runtime. I'm still buying into that concept. So to me, that is the maximum what I accept. It needs to run overnight. That is where I want to get.
Yeah, just want to add a couple of things. I think the numbers are right. I mean, if you have a a couple million people and you do 100% assignment with this type of technology, is a couple of hours. And because we run travel to equilibrium and land use we don't, it's always going to be slower. So I think we have to accept that and work around that. Now, what we can certainly do is, as you mentioned, we can do samples, so just assign 10%, which for a lot of situations in this type of technology is actually enough, which is nearly linear. So actually a factor of 10 faster, which makes 10 hours into 1 hour, maybe 2, somewhere in that range. So you can certainly do that, and we have fairly good results with that. The second thing is actually that you don't need these 100 iterations every time you run that, Because if you somehow save the equilibrium state from the previous year and you essentially just move those people around that had moved, it's actually much, much faster. This is a bit tricky to implement. We had it for MedSim, for UrbanSim. It's now gone, but it's feasible. We know it's feasible. I can't say, but you can probably get away with about 30 iterations, maybe even less. So that's another factor of 3. I agree that we don't have to run this every year, although there's a trade-off. I mean, if you run it every 5 years, more people have moved, so you need more iterations. But a lot of this, I think, what's more important is that we can actually do microscopic queries. Yeah, somebody considers a place where to move to and ask, well, how long does it take my public transit to go to? As long as you don't put in a new public transit line, we essentially don't need to rerun that. It's pretty much the same. So I think there's probably a factor of 10 in this whole thing. If you say right now it's 4 hours, I would say it's more like 0.4 hours in the long run. But that's rough. Yeah. And the stochastic problems remain. I mean, in theory, we could run this on 10 computers in parallel, and then we get 10 stochastic samples for the same computing time, but then we need to get the hardware somewhere. But I mean, just in terms of technology, that's not a major problem.
So a very simple and probably naive question. Isn't the real cost in initial model calibration rather than in subsequent simulation? And so where do the differences lie between the two approaches when we are thinking about initial calibration?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. So the initial model calibration, the model setup, model estimation takes way longer than running the model. But that's not really what we count, right? We say, okay, that's just our time that we put into the model. But what we are discussing here now is how can we run scenarios? I mean, but you're raising a very good point. Yeah, we spend way more time developing these models than actually running these models. Yeah, true.
We had an interesting discussion over a glass of wine last night about neighborhood effects on behaviors and choices. So whether there are kind of pressures from if your neighbors are all cycling, or your neighbors are all buying electric cars, or your neighbors are all fitting solar panels, does that reflect in a greater uptake in a spatial area? Could these attributes of households and persons and dwellings allow you to explore those kinds of almost agglomerations of behavior in these models, and therefore these kinds of the speed of transitions from current ways of practice to other ways in the future? Is that the kind of thing you could test with your model?
Yeah, that's a cool point. It's not implemented as a model right now, but basically it's Hagerstrand, right? It's Hagerstrand, how something spreads around the area. And I learned the statistics that the biggest influencing variable on whether you have a hybrid car or not is whether your neighbor have a hybrid car or not. It's a bigger explanatory variable than income or environmental consciousness. It's what do your neighbors do, right? You follow up with that. That's a good point. It's not implemented right now. I imagine it couldn't be so hard to look at what the neighborhood composition is, but it's not in the model right now. But I like that. I like that idea.
Thank you. I think, Rolf, you are improving your life expectancy already. So. Now, 2 questions, and one practical, one theoretical. And the practical question is that I think the mobile phone smartphone penetration rates in developed countries is 90% now. And I suspect that is not, when you say mobile phones, it's not to do with the penetration rate, but actually the long-term stable pattern of the use of it. And people have very different ways of using it. I don't really justify my use of my smartphone, so I make sporadic use of it, sometimes a very mild amount, sometimes nothing at all. So I expect that if there's something to do with the route choice, it must be that the long-term pattern. So it's really after the initial phase of the smartphones. I just wondered whether such information should actually be now collected, or such process should be initiated for this sort of thing. So that's the first point. Well, because I think we should learn from the health gadgets around people's arms. Actually, people that fails to take off, and I think the use of mobile phones will have a similar dynamics, and for how people become aware of where they are and how they travel. Yeah, because some people are not responsive to it. Secondly, in terms of the theoretical point, and I think there is one sentence in the middle of your presentation which says the choices are less about utilities but about satisfying needs. And I thought that if you go back to the generic definition of utilities, it is to do with the satisfying needs. So I think when you say utility, you may be only saying something that you observe, or something that you take into account. So, well, for example, in the logic discrete choice models, there's always the V part and the error part, right? So I suspected that error part will have included all your other things. So I'm not sure whether you are actually breaking that doctrine, or actually you are you're just basically it's a shorthand way of saying the V and the epsilon. So that one I want to clarify.
So on your first point, smartphone penetration rate, I just looked up the data the other day because I was writing on a paper, and I found out there was a study by the Pew Research in the US, and they found that in 2014, the penetration rate of smartphones among high-income people with $75,000 or more, was 87%, but among lower-income people, which was defined as $30,000 or less, was 50%. So it is much lower there. There is a segment of the population where it's lower. So I guess the 90% penetration rate is probably cell phones, but when you look at smartphones, there's definitely an income gap. But I really like your point that not everybody who owns a smartphone uses it. I mean, I just was assuming from my own behavior that when I get in a car, I turn on the smartphone because if there's an accident, I want to drive around it, right? I don't want to get caught in that traffic jam. On your second point, maximizing utility. So the way I meant this here in this presentation was, if you use the traditional logic model, the higher utility makes it more likely to choose that option. And that's what I meant by you're always driving towards the highest utility. You're right, this is not absolutely maximized. There's no equilibrium that everybody has the maximum utility. But I was trying to make the point, constraints limit you much further from these high utilities because there's a certain distance you can travel to work, and beyond that, it's just unbearable to travel that far. Well, that's where I was coming from.
But that can be integrated in this model. And it can be integrated in the model, so actually, yeah, so I don't think actually it was a fundamental theoretical issue. And one should, I think we should uphold the concept of utility as being the complete understanding of how people travel. Of course, any individual, even actually you do microsimulate, you won't be able to get 100% out of this. But that doesn't actually affect the theoretical concept.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, granted, you're totally right. Totally agree. Yeah, yeah. Gebhard, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice presentation and discussion. I think it's really a great challenge to put that forward, so good luck for that. I have two very small concerns on the first points, that is the study area and the zones, the raster grid. Your study area is already very big, but I would like to say perhaps it's still too small. Specifically looking to the south, there is a lot of exchange, perhaps more in leisure trips and in other trips than in commuting. but do you also integrate those other trip purpose to compensate for the metropolitan region, which just for the locals, incorporates, for example, Bad Tölz-Wolfratshausen as a county to the south within the very small public transport authority area, the MVV region, which is the transport association, is included already there. And the second point is on the raster grids. I very much like the idea to have this flexible sizing of the grid, but how do you cope with the fact that potentially in the future, if you look at land use development over the next decades, other places will be more densely populated, so new housing developments, new, I don't know, activity zones or whatsoever, shopping and leisure parks could show up in a zone where today you just have a very coarse raster grid. Something that, I would like to hear how you intend to work on that.
Thank you. So the first point, the size of the study area, you were part of delineating the study area, so you're partly to blame here. So the study area has been delineated based on commute trips because the idea was to build an integrated land use transport model, and for that it was assumed commute trips are a good delineating factor, whereas leisure trips, going skiing on the weekend, would probably not change your housing location as much, affect your housing location as much as the work location. And to me, this is still something that is in flux. So for now, I really like how we delineated it. And just FYI, we are about here. So just that you get an idea, we are just outside of the study area. But it may well be that we find out, well, maybe it's not enough to run 10% in MatSim, but we need 50% in MatSim. And that also might affect the size of the study area, that we say we just can't take as much a region that is as big. So it might change over time. Leisure trips at this point would be completely, leisure trips that go towards outside the study area would be taken as external trips, and they would not be treated further. Depends a little bit on what you use the model for. If that is your purpose of analysis, you would extend the study area to the south. But we haven't thought much about leisure trips. But the cool thing about this tool that Joe wrote for us is it's highly flexible. So you can just switch to a different study area and build a zone system and say, I need 5,000 zones. And it spits out a raster cell system with 5,000 zones. Now then, the second question you asked how to deal with future development. Well, short answer, we don't. What you say, this makes a lot of sense. It's totally correct. And ideally, we would know, this is future development, so let's rasterize this more finely even today. But that's a lot of manual work. We just haven't spent any time on looking into that. But if you know of any regions that are going to be developed, and I'm sure you know this much better than I do, I would love if you just took a map and drew a circle, and then I would ask Joe, well, rewrite this because we need more spatial resolution here.
Of course, some spots are known now, but many spots will not be known, neither by me nor anybody else. So isn't that a methodological problem to say, I'm able to have this zoning adapted to the local structure, or do we need to go for a regular grid of whatsoever, 100 meter or so everywhere? Because we will never know exactly what will happen where in the next decades.
Well, I like this comment, I like this idea. I would say, where there's more population today, there will be more population in 50 years down the road. So the big picture of the distribution of the population doesn't change tremendously in 50 years. Using a regular grid for the entire study area also needs a lot of resources for rural areas that we save in this approach. But I would like to know how other people deal with this problem.
I think you should mention, at least please confirm, that workplaces including retail facilities, are still exogenous for the present situation. This is no criticism, it's simply a long-term plan, I understand.
Yes, that's correct. At this point, workplaces, firms are not modeled, but the workplace forecast is exogenous.
I'm curious to hear about your thoughts, sort of collective thoughts on the time scale or the time resolution of the integrated models, because we sort of are modeling in the same framework or attempting to model decisions that are sometimes nearly instantaneous, like route choice, for example, if we're thinking about people responding to incidents, right, and being able to capture that in the network simulation, all the way to events that happen once a year, or sometimes even with less frequency than that. And so how do we reconcile that? I mean, do we need that level of detail at which we are attempting to measure travel times and how travel times change on the network to feed back all the way to the models that are actually just giving us, presumably just need sort of general levels of accessibility for someone to be able to say, here are places that are good choices for home location given where I work, or vice versa, for example. So that's one, and kind of that's something that's sort of been there, and I know there's been some discussion of this at different levels, but the other one is going back to the concept of microsimulation, which I agree with you. I think it's the right approach, but the question rises, and again, it's a question that partly with runtimes, with the level of resolution of the space and time and the data available, is how much detail do we put into the model? How much detail is sufficient for what we're trying to get out of the model versus how much is just us sort of indulging our, passion for modeling, because it does have an impact on the resources that it takes to build and maintain these models, and the resources that the agency has to put into actually using them for forecasting. And I think that's one where, again, there seems to be not a whole lot of guidance, or people have different thoughts into, we do it because we can and we have the data available, but then once you take these models and move them into a situation where the data don't exist, then they collapse, right? Then they cannot be used, and so you have to sort of think of different approaches. And so I wonder if there's other approaches that work in those contexts, then why can we feed them back to the situation where we sort of live in a sort of embarrassment of riches, right? Where we have a lot of resources available, so we use them.
Well, so your first comment, I only can say it's something we try. We try to go at a finest temporal resolution and see what is the impact. If someone works night shifts and the bus is not running overnight, then transit is not an option, and that might affect location choice. So that is something we're going to play with, and I don't know how much the impact actually is going to be, because, yeah, you're right, for land use decision, that's a long time decision, and people like you and I who just commute on very regular times, it probably doesn't make much of a difference to take the microscopic travel time. But I'm thinking for those who need to go very early, very late, for those it might. And the other question, I really like this comment, how much detail do we really need in the models? And of course we have the tendency to just put ever more detail in the model. And in research, partly because that's what we get funding for. And I think that's also a problem. So in Maryland, we were putting a lot of detail with respect to racial segregation into the model, because in Maryland we have this huge problem that to the eastern side, PG County, east of Washington, D.C., it's mostly African American, and towards the western side it's much wider. And we were trying to replicate that, and so we had crime rate in the model, share of different ethnicities and the segregation tendencies, school quality. There are a bunch of other variables that we felt were necessary for that context. But I'm planning to scrap all those variables here because they're not relevant in the Munich region. But I don't have a good answer for your question. To me, it's playing with the level of detail and adding another variable and seeing what is the actual impact.
I don't think you should take out the ethnicity quite yet, because it does work on the housing market quite substantially. Even in Zurich, you can show that certain areas are much more immigrant heavy than others for various reasons. So I wouldn't scratch ethnicity quite yet, and I think you will find that areas with lots of Turkish residents don't attract as high prices as others, even in Munich. I think that was one point. And then there's another issue. You delineated your study area, your catchment area, by the commuting time to center of town. Now, is center of town still relevant? Because even Munich has outlying sub-centers which become relevant. But even more importantly, what do you do with two-income households which live all of these wonderful new forms of life, with one partner being here, the other partner being there? They each meet in the family home there. They have one set of kids which commute to meet them for every second weekend here, and then they all go to a weekend home every fourth week. So the argument is, how can you be sure that this is really exhaustive? Now, clearly you can say, too few of those people are there, we don't worry. But I think it's one of the issues, in particular, if you want to extend the work to the household decision, that it becomes relevant, that you have to include that.
Okay, I'll be honest, I didn't understand where you're going with this.
I think the question is that your delineation of the catchment areas is too narrow by a long shot.
The catchment area for the place to work. So in Maryland, it worked at the zonal level. It's not the city center, but it's a zonal level. So there are travel analysis zones, and the travel time to these TSEs, which is like another restriction in the model, yeah? So you say TSEs, there are two cores to work with.
It's just that the choice set for housing is too narrow, because households might choose to have houses way beyond what you see, because other concerns come in. And in addition, if we think about a world in which more people work part-time or have more at-home work, the constraint might be much looser than we currently conceived.
Absolutely, yeah, totally agree. Last question, I just realized that we're running behind time already, but...
Just a quick comment, and to ask what you do with you simulate both male and female members of household, is that right? So in the UK we see very, very different patterns of how they travel. And this links to what Kai was saying about part-time work and also the looser constraints and so on. So that is a very fruitful area of investigation. And you may have already done something.
Not yet, only conceptually thought about that we want to implement part-time and telework, definitely, and that would be sex-dependent. But otherwise, we don't distinguish child behavior by gender at this point. But thanks for the comment.
As such, yeah, I agree with Kai, but male and females actually have very, very different patterns, and actually this is one thing which is long ignored in modeling, so largely because we couldn't actually work with data we want to work with, but I think now with this framework you should do something about it.
All right, thanks for the comment. Okay, so nobody reined me in, so I ran over time already. When you present, I'm going to watch the clock, so I'm going to keep you on track. But it's time for lunch, and I promise that we take a peek in the Pope room. So let's just walk to the Pope room, take a peek, and then we go into the so-called Gewölbehalle, one flight down, to have lunch. And then we meet again at 2 o'clock. I'm going to take a group picture then, and then start with the next presentation. Thank you.